there is a new religious life, I think it's got to be right on the edge of church.
And there's a sense about the core of religious life being the search for the sacred, and however you want to describe it, but it's around knowing God.
Far fewer people are now joining what we would call conventional religious congregations, but a lot of them are joining these new groups. Now, what is it that they find that attracts them?
I think if we want to pass on what has been, I guess, of the essence of who we have been and will no longer be, I think it has to contain those contemplative or mystic elements as well as that prophetic edge.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm David Frost. No, sorry. One of the things that we'd like to discuss tonight is the context of the role of religious life in the community, and it's going to be a bit of a discussion, a bit of an interaction about that, and looking at where religious life will go into the future and perhaps the impact it will have on the world globally. So, and that concept that Elia Delio talks about in terms of through the death of organisations or things, that there's a new birthing. I'll be interested just to explore that too, Marlat, that you mentioned that with the death of things, there's the birth of something new. Do we see on the table at the moment that there are new ministries arising or new ideas or landscapes where religious life can explore into the future?
I personally don't think the new will come within religious congregations. If I look at Presentation Sisters internationally, I think we still have women who are young enough to engage in a global mission, but that will eventually come to an end too. I mean, that's, you know, the challenge in that for us at the moment is that in the developed world, we're getting old and it's becoming harder to engage in that kind of ministry, whereas in places like India and Africa and the Philippines, our sisters are so caught up with meeting the urgent needs of their local area that for their congregations to release them to engage in a global mission is a huge thing, just because of the urgency of the needs where they are. Where I think the new will come is in the partnerships. I don't think, in the developed world at least, that we have the capacity to to nurture the new among us. I don't think that capacity is within our Queensland congregation, for example, and I don't think it's among the 6 presentation congregations in Australia. Where I would see the new coming is where we can, in partnership with other groups, and often this will be through financial support rather even than personnel, because we're very thin on the ground with personnel, that we can support groups to do something new. I think the new for us is the letting go. The new thing for us is not to be in charge, is not to have an identity that's associated with an institution. The new thing for us is to say, almost like we are now becoming compost for whatever is going to grow next. So I think that whole, Tony was the one that got me onto the compost thing with one of his spiritual sessions once. And I really do think if we can see ourselves as a kind, and the wonderful work we've done in the past. We've done fantastic work. Our ministries have been amazing. We've nurtured so much new life among people. But that's now like compost for whatever's going to come next. And the newness for us is the willingness to be compost, not digging.
Well, in terms of that, in the letting go, Tony, would you say that the letting go allows the partnerships to flourish in that rejuvenated territory or compost territory. I'm interested in the wider community, but I'm also interested to see if there is room for different religious life orders to work together.
Well, I think it is the future. I mean, we can't
Yes.
do it on our own.
Absolutely.
We have to work if we wish to continue
But we are,
to,
surely.
to exist. We have to work with other religious congregations because we've got a whole thing here around religious life. We're talking about religious life more than necessarily the mission.
Yes.
So I've got a great interest in that.
Yeah.
Like you've got Tom here, he's a Dominican. Well, obviously, priesthood is a part of the religious life of the Dominicans. Now, that's very different to ourselves as brothers. We don't have that sacramental responsibility. And I think that's the future is around the works,
Yeah.
the ministries, the mission. That's the future
Yeah.
in terms of partnerships. It's not the future of religious life.
No.
Like,
No.
how, when you say the future of religious life, this group of men or women who
Yeah.
have vowed themselves to the 3 evangelical councils years ago within a canonical structure within the church, what's the future of that?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the works
That's-
will go on. I've got
Yeah.
no doubt the
Yeah.
works will go
So
on.
I think that's
through-
what I was saying.
Yes.
I don't think there's anything new for
That
that,
we can
canonical
do.
structure in religious life.
That, I agree with
think
you. It's
that
not
will
going to
die
happen
out.
with him.
That
It's not
will
going to
just
happen
go.
with us.
So
No.
whatever is
It
new
won't.
will need to happen out in the mission.
It needs to happen,
In
and
the
it needs to,
ministries.
I think, happen. If there is a new religious life, I think it's got to be right on the edge of church. It's got to
Yes.
happen right on the edge.
I want to
Because-
explore that concept.
Because if you go
certainly-
to what the core of the religious life is, I mean, we all came out of apostolic religious life, whereas Tom's order went way back before that and was all about preaching the word of God. And there's a sense about the core of religious life being the search for the sacred. And however you want to describe it, but it's around knowing God and developing your life
And
around
you see, I
that.
think now, though, since the Second Vatican Council, and I would hope it would develop a bit more as time goes on, I don't think that's any longer the reserve of religious life.
Oh, I don't think
that's
so
the
either.
reserve of all
Those
baptised
people. Yeah.
Of all people.
Of all people.
Of all people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I often think apostolic religious life really arose to meet a particular
A need.
that no longer exists. And I think our purpose, our call was to, you know, as you say, the search for the sacred and the addressing of social need. Now, I think that's a call that's for all people now. And I don't think there's a need for religious life anymore. I don't see that there's a problem in the fact that in the evolution of Christianity, the evolution of the cosmos, that drops off and something else happens. I don't think
I
that's
don't have a problem with that either, actually. You know.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably see religious life out in our lifetime, but I don't think it will continue.
I
beyond
think
that.
there'll always be a need for religious life in the contemplative dimension.
Contemplative, yes,
I mean, I
that's
think
right.
that will always be there.
Exactly.
Bringing people to the contemplative dimension, but you're right.
Not
with
the
all
apostolic.
apostolic, everything else.
I'm surprised that we haven't yet mentioned any of the new forms of. It's not strictly a religious life, but what we call them ecclesial associations or Christian groups. I mean, there are lots of them now in Australia and elsewhere in the world. It's an interesting question, I think. To what extent are these bodies going to be the successors to religious? You know, I'm thinking Focolare, Opus Dei, Missionaries of God's Love, Community of San Egidio. All of these groups are new. And I think there is you can see not a system, but in the beginning, if you wanted to give yourself totally to God, you ended up as a martyr in the Roman Empire. That's when Christianity started. Then the empire went Christian, and if you wanted to give yourself completely to God, you went out into the desert and became a hermit, female as well as male. Then, because the hermits, the better known ones, more successful, if it's not the right word, communities attached themselves to them. And so you had the beginnings of monastic life. And then in the 12th century or roundabout, come what we call the mendicants, a new form of religious life where you didn't live your life within the four walls of a monastery, tilling the soil, working in the library and praying in the chapel, but you went out into the street wherever you could find people and helped them to know God, basically. Now, I see that process, was the word I was struggling for, continuing today. After the mendicants came the active, as we call it, what's the word? In the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, and even more recently in 18th, 19th century, you had the apostolic orders. That's what they're called commonly, but there's also a large emphasis on spirituality and reaching out towards God. Now, I think that same kind of process is continuing. Today, a lot of the religious orders we're declining in numbers, and some of us are reconciled to the fact that we're going to go out of existence. But there's new bodies being born, and that's the process that's, I think, it's important to recognise. And so it's not tragedy, it's, as we were saying earlier, I think, it's death bringing about new life.
Tom, you mentioned Focolare and San Egidio groups, and I just recall in World Youth Day in 2008 there was a rise in religious fervour around some conservative groups that had made their presence known. I'd be interested to see a bit more of what your experience is of those groups in Australia, and whether you feel that they are on the move and developing and fulfilling a particular need here.
I don't have a close, long experience with any of them, but I read about them as we all do. But the point that impresses me is they are growing, and they are obviously answering a need of vast numbers of young people. Now, there's no doubt for me, from my perspective, I would call many of them conservative, but it's a label that's become almost meaningless because it can mean so many different things. But I joined religious life. It was largely in the early 60s. For my generation, I think, it was a relationship with God was the main concern. And I saw God calling me to join this particular way of life. Now, the fact is that far fewer people are now joining what we would call conventional religious congregations. But a lot of them are joining these new groups. Now, what is it that they find that attracts them? Clearly, they're deeply religious young people. God is important to their lives, and they see these groups as offering them a way of life which will bring them closer to God, and also, I think in most cases, enable them to have something to offer to their own generation.
See, I agree basically with what you're saying. I entered it in the late 60s, and I certainly wanted, you know, the search for God thing, but I also wanted to change the world. And I think, you know, whatever we say about the groups like Focolare and Sant'Egidio and these groups, if we're talking about religious life, I think at the core of apostolic religious life, I can't speak too much about, you know, monastic life or priesthood, that sort of thing, but at the core of apostolic religious life, I think, are the two dimensions of mysticism and the prophetic element. Now, I would say, just from my brief knowledge of the groups you've been talking about, that that prophetic dimension is not strong. So, I mean, if we're talking about, you know, if religious life in its present form is dying out, is there something new to take its place? There may be many new things, but if we're talking about something similar to religious life, I think it would have to have those two dimensions of the mysticism and the prophetic dimension, because I think that's what apostolic religious life is about at its heart. And as I say, I think the prophetic dimension is not strong in the groups that you've mentioned. Maybe Sant'Egidio is a bit different because they're very much on about, I suppose, well, I don't know if it's about changing social structures, but it's certainly addressing social needs in a way that could be prophetic, but I don't know enough about it.
I'd also be really interested in hearing, like, out of what image of God are they coming? Are they going to those groups? Like, what is their image of God that attracts them to those groups that are quite conservative? I'd be really, I don't know enough about them, but I often wonder about, because the image of God is integral to everything, to theos belongs, as she said in her article, I think, cosmos. So what's their understanding of the whole theological dimension of life that would draw them to those kind of groups? And what are they hearing in scripture and preaching and all that stuff?
But I think that, you know, what you were talking about before, Tony, and even Sandra with the partnership things, I think if we want to pass on what has been, I guess, of the essence of who we have been and will no longer be, I think it has to contain those contemplative or mystic elements as well as that prophetic edge. And I think that's what we need to leave behind as members of religious congregations. That, you know, we're not here to form groups like Focolare or whatever, but that somehow what we pass on through our charisms has to contain within its seed what has been at the heart of who we've been. You know?
I think there was a marvellous example of that for me. Probably all familiar with it, but most of us probably did see our new Pope Francis on television saying that when he greeted his cardinals immediately after his election, one of them whispered in his ear, "Don't forget the poor." And I thought that's symbolic because millions of people have seen that. And, you know, what does it mean to be church? How should you be able to identify the Christian church? The poor get fed.
Exactly. And that's been at the heart of all apostolic religious life. Has been, if there's one thing common, we did this exercise 20 years ago, I remember looking at our charisms. And the thing that was common across all of the charisms of religious congregations in Queensland was our commitment to those who are poor and powerless. That's very
Marlette,
true what you say.
I love that poem you told us about the other day, the one from Mary Oliver.
Oh, yes. It's one of Mary Oliver's poems that I think sums up both, I suppose, the contemplative and the prophetic dimension of religious life. She calls it instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be amazed, tell about it. And I think that's really been a bit what we've been on about in religious life. The contemplative pay attention to the voice of God, to the signs of the times, be amazed, and then tell about it.
I was listening to principal talking about some wonderful speeches that he'd heard and quoting all of these different people, Romero, etc. And no one was paying attention. None of the young people were paying attention. Then Mother Teresa came along. They looked up and then they looked down. And then Beyonce came up. And she said something like, from the mistakes I've made, I have been defined as to who I am. And the girls are going, yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder who are our prophets today, and are we allowing them, a bit of what Tom was saying before, if you go the whole hog, you get martyred somewhere down the track. How do we look after our prophets, and who's doing the talking today, and are we allowing those voices to be heard?
Well, I have a bias there. I think our environmentalists are our prophets. People like Julia Butterfly Hill, who will live in the top of a tree, a redwood, for years to protect it. Same in Tasmania, they're doing it. People who are going down to protect the whales. There's something, people who are standing up against CSG because they love the land, because they love the water, because they know they are related to the water. The water and I are one, as it were. I think they're the real prophets who are trying to save something that's very sacred, not just for future generations, which is wonderful, and so we can feed the poor, which is wonderful, but because the earth is sacred, because earth is me, I am earth, and earth is sacred, and it's divine. From that point of view, they want to save it. I think they're the prophets today. But I don't know how much listening is going on to them, because they do get shot down very quickly, whether it's politically or otherwise. So for me, that's my bias. I think those people who really stand up against the corporations, the mining giants, the politicians, to get a quick buck, because they want to preserve something that's really sacred. It's the whole Indigenous thing. It's the Australian Aboriginal, the American Indian. They knew it, they know it, or they did know it.
I think there's a temptation to think there are only a few prophets. That's why I'm having trouble answering the question. I've been working with Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream Symposium, and it's a very powerful symposium. But part of it is you go through this whole kind of training session, and you start off by being overwhelmed by the disasters of the universe as they are, and then gradually you see all the good that's being done. But part of it is they have this list on the PowerPoint of all the groups who are doing something to save the universe and to change the way we look at society and to improve the way we relate to each other. And they can't put them all there because it would go on for about 3 days. And it's the most exciting thing. Like, every time I see this happen, I think to myself, all these people, individuals and groups are prophets. And they all speak to different people. They don't all speak to me, they don't all speak to Tony, but they speak to someone. And I think that's the important thing. I just can't call to mind yet, but there's that lovely reflection that says something about we are the ones, we are the people. I forget what it is now, but it's we are the people that we want to save us, but we're the ones, like we're all prophets. And I think we have to stop thinking that there are just one or two out there, that we all have the global responsibility to be prophets, and can be. And are. There are lots of people who are.
Tom?
There are many different kinds of prophets. One kind that I have particular respect for is, throughout my time in religious life, the men and women who stand up to the authoritarianism that we sometimes find in Rome, they're prophets for me. They speak the truth out loud and suffer for it from their church. That's prophecy.
I just thought of that line, we are the people we are waiting for. We are the people we are waiting for.
Is there a shift from the different religious life groups working with human poverty towards an earth poverty? Is there a shift that's been chosen, or it's come about, or there's a movement, would you say, towards making transformation
There's
saving?
no difference. There's no difference. Wherever the earth is most degraded, wherever the earth is raped, those that are most affected are the poor, and usually that's women and children. That's statistical proof. That's not just a pious idea. There's no difference. And there's that lovely thing, we're all connected, you know, to care for those who are poor is to care for the poor earth. To care for poor earth is to care for those who are poor. If I want to heal the earth, I begin by healing myself.
I think
We're all
what has
connected.
changed, and the shift you're probably alluding to, is this awareness of the earth and awareness of cosmology and awareness of how important it is to care about earth and care for creation and all of that. Now that's come alive in spirituality throughout, and it's come alive in religious congregations, because we get the opportunity often that other people sometimes don't get to read, to hear about this, to listen to speakers, to make retreats that have those focus. So I think it's just that it's that has come, it's burgeoned in the last 10 years at least, if not more. I can remember you having that burning interest in this many years ago. So it's gone for, I think that's what's shifted. And that's part of the shift that happens in life, that, new interests, that there was a time when the important thing that was part of women's spirituality was the whole feminine dimension. Now there's much more focus on the whole earth dimension or care of creation dimension.
And I think to mention that women are more, I think you said
In
something,
tune.
attuned to that. I think that is so, it's the feminine that have brought that into religious life. I don't think the men have done it. The men are very slow for whatever reason, we're doers, we're what. I don't think the women religious, particularly in the States, have done so much in this area of care of this earth-human relationship.
Sure.
Thomas Berry, the great passionist, said that he believes that any religious order of the future for the 21st century needs to be founded on the earth-human relationship now, because all religious orders up to this point have been founded on the human-human relationship, social justice, and that's fine, that's been good, nursing, teaching, blah. And he says he believes that any religious order now that is founded ought to be founded on this earth-human, that we are so connected to this, and we're trashing her, we're trashing the most beautiful thing we know, we're trashing our home. So, you've got Green Mountain Monastery in the States with Gal Wichello and Bernadette Bostwick, who started, Genesis Fund. They've started a new religious kind of congregation focused on that area, and I think, personally, that's a big future that religious can lead. We do have the properties to do that, we've got the resources to do that, that others don't have. So I think that's the thing a legacy we could leave for the world in the future.
That's what you were saying before. What's the wisdom that we
what's
leave
the
behind?
wisdom?
And I think it's that emerging spirituality that happens over time, and religious have that opportunity often to develop that. And now I can remember going right back when we first started through Mary Tinney's work, the Earthlink. It got to a stage where every group's involved in, there are so many other community groups doing that sort of thing. You can move on then to something else and to another awakening, another appreciation of parts of the spirituality that relate to the earth and to the whole cosmos.
Eco-spirituality can have a very bad name, particularly among religious, because we're on about social justice, we're on about the poor, we're out there in the streets, feeding the hungry, blah, blah, blah. You people are tree huggers. You're living in lovely environments, it's quiet, there's solitude, it's all about trees, but what's that really got to do? And I think, as Marlette rightly said, For me, you cannot separate the two. But I think the deeper issue around eco-spirituality, and I've said what I think I wanted to say about caring for the earth because it's sacred, is this awareness of the new consciousness. I think religious have an opportunity to begin to educate people in a different understanding of God through the whole new story, new consciousness, and the evolutionary dynamic, divine dynamic of our whole universe, that we are expanding, we're changing in extraordinary rates, in extraordinary quick time, and it's all about participation. Now, if we get on board with that, I don't know whether the official church can do that because there's a lot of theological structures, your structures around that priests and those who work in that very structured environment have to maintain. Look at Billy Morris, steps out of line, says something, a prophet, I believe, he gets wiped. But I think religious, who we're supposed to be the dangerous memory of the church, who live on the edge of it, we have an opportunity if we can really absorb what this whole new consciousness is about. It's a whole new consciousness of a God that is evolving, a God who is becoming, not being, but is becoming, as I am, as Earth is. Now that can shock a lot of people, when you start to talk about, I'm really Earth in human form here. I am worth preserving, and you are, as much as that tree. Different values. So I just wanted to get that point about the whole evolutionary context, and there's a real divine thing underneath the care of the earth that I don't think a lot of people grasp, but a lot of people just think it's about, caring for the earth and clean water and that, and it is, but it's a lot deeper, and you only get to that through contemplation. You only get to that through really sitting in the earth, in the silence, and working with it and standing with people with CSG and the mining. And I think you only get to it through deep, deep kind of contemplation. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Tony.
And a lot of reading.
Okay.
You're not going to hear this in the pulpits.
No.
You won't hear this taught in schools. Well, it's moving to schools. You won't hear it in the churches. You've got to read. If you really want to get on board, you've got to read it today. And there's lots of wonderful stuff being written by the Thomas Berrys and Brian Swings and so many others.
And Billy Morris talks about how do we keep the rumour of God alive. And I'm interested, just as we finish now, just to hear a little bit of what your charism says and would like to share in terms of the wisdom it would like to leave behind. And I'll start with you, Marlette. Would you like to finish up?
Well, I think a charism is like a gospel value or gospel values that address certain needs. And the way that those needs are addressed may change over time, but the value stays the same. And I think for the charism of Presentation Sisters, it's the two gospel values, I think, would be compassion and justice. And I guess what I'd like to think we could leave behind would be the way in which people can own or hold those two values and live them out in a very different world from the world of Nano Nagel. And, I think you look at a charism like compassion, and you think of the wonderful work Judy Canato did to describe compassion in an evolutionary cosmos, and the way you can reinterpret a gospel value like that in terms of this evolutionary consciousness. It's a huge gift to be able to do that. And I think you can do the same with the justice, How do we address especially this big, huge question of poverty in a way that welcomes all people to the table of life as kin? That's the big thing. And so I'd like to think that somehow in the work that we do, as we have done and that we will continue to do in whatever partnerships we can form, we somehow help people to explore those two gospel values and the way they can meet the needs of the world today.
Tom?
I'd like to put in a different way what I think Tony was saying, to do with our relationship with God and the cosmos. There's no doubt, I think we'd all agree, that the more we deepen our understanding, appreciation of our world, the greater are the opportunities for getting insights into the nature of God. But my final word is, I think also we need to think of it in the other direction, that our whole lives, including our involvement with the cosmos and our care of creation as stewards, it's an expression of a relationship that we already have with God. And we express our relationship with God by caring for his creation, because that's what he wants. And because there's a love relationship, and the way we express that relationship is caring for what God cares about. So that you see, I'm finished. Mass, we listen to God and we respond to God. And he feeds us with the Eucharist. And at the end of the Mass, the priest says, now go and preach the gospel. Go and care for creation. Because that's the only way you can develop the relationship that you've just been celebrating.
Thank you.
How do I follow that? I was thinking of charism as like the lens through which we look to see the world. And I thought back to Catherine Macaulay's definition of what do you need to be a sister of mercy? She was asked one time, and she said there are two things: an ardent desire for union with God and a love for the poor. And I suppose in the context of our discussion tonight, the poor could be, can be, is both the earth that we talk about and the people. And I would like to think that we would particularly care for those who are homeless. I just think that in our world today, people shouldn't be, in a developed country like Australia, there shouldn't be homeless people. And there are so many. And I'd love us, we've got a chapter coming at the end of this year, and I would dearly love, though I won't have all the say, but I would dearly love us to have a focus for the next 5 years that really focused on how we could partner with other groups to address homelessness. But we'll wait and see.
Well, we brothers have done a lot on our charism in recent years, and we've come down to those three great values of presence, liberation and compassion. And I guess I would like to see, if the Christian brothers are remembered for anything, that they would leave this a reverent presence in the earth, which in some ways linked to our vow of poverty, like living simply, lightly on the earth, but with real reverence and a presence to the whole earth community, human and other than human. So that's one thing and then the whole thing of liberation, that we'd be sort of remembered that we've liberated a whole lot of, all of the whole earth community. We've liberated from oppression, we've liberated people from ignorance, poverty, and we've liberated people's creativity. And then the third one, compassion, and that I think that liberation is something I link to our obedience, listening, and really listening to people and listening to the earth. And then compassion. Compassion for the poor, compassion for the trees that are being destroyed, compassion for the people who are losing their properties, compassion for the whales, compassion for people who haven't got food, and housing the Syrians, and so that whole sense of it's relational stuff. That's our vow, I think, of celibacy, chastity, that whole interrelatedness. We need compassion because we're all connected.
So I'd just like to thank everyone for their presence here this evening, their wisdom and generosity of spirit, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about partnerships that go into the future with the different charisms. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.